I must warn you. This is not the Rome of shining marble statues, glorious victories, and noble Caesars that you've read about in schoolbooks. This is a darker Rome, the Rome of shadows, of whispers and corridors, and of secrets too twisted for the official histories. At the heart of it all stood Gaius Caligula. To some he was the chosen ruler of the gods, to others a monster in human form. And to many who lived under his rule, he was a terrifying mix of both divine and deranged, savior and executioner. Imagine walking through his palace, golden ceilings glimmering, marble floors echoing with the footsteps of trembling servants, and in the throne room, a man who turned absolute power into a stage for madness. They called him a god. They called him a madman. They called him a curse upon Rome, and tonight you are going to hear why. Because once you step inside Caligula's palace, and see the obsessions and horrors he created, you will never look at emperors or Rome the same way again. Caligula was not born into obscurity. He was the cherished son of Germanicus, the great Roman general who was adored by the legions and worshipped by the people. Germanicus was everything a Roman hero should be: brave, victorious, and loyal. And wherever he marched, little Caligula was at his side. As a child, he was dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny boots. The soldiers laughed and gave him a nickname that would follow him forever: Caligula, Little Boots. They thought it was endearing. To them, he was the mascot of the empire's armies, a symbol of innocence and future glory. But behind the smiles and the playful name, a seed of darkness was already taking root. Caligula was growing up not in a home of warmth, but in the shadow of blood, politics, and betrayal. He learned early that power was never safe, and that even those who loved you could vanish overnight. When he finally came to power at just 25 years old, Rome erupted in celebration. The streets overflowed with cheering crowds, temples filled with prayers, and senators bowed deeply in relief. After years of uncertainty, the empire believed they had found their savior, a ruler sent by the gods themselves. For a brief shining moment, Caligula was seen as the answer to Rome's prayers, a gift of divine favor. But the light did not last. Within months, the cheers that once shook the city began to fade into whispers of unease, of cruelty, and of something far darker lurking beneath the crown. At first, it seemed harmless strange jokes, bizarre requests, and wild spending that drained the treasury. Many laughed nervously, thinking it was the eccentricity of youth. But soon, those quirks hardened into something far more sinister. Executions were no longer solemn affairs of justice. Caligula staged them like spectacles, designed to shock and terrify. Men of honor were cut down not for crimes but for his amusement, and the Senate trembled, knowing that loyalty offered no protection. But what unsettled Rome most was not just his cruelty in politics, it was the collapse of all boundaries behind palace walls. Private life became public theater. Banquets stretched deep into the night where wine flowed endlessly and shame was abandoned. Guests were forced to watch, to participate, to surrender their dignity as Caligula turned meals into grotesque performances. He blurred every line between ruler and subject, between love and humiliation, between desire and domination. To Caligula, the empire itself was a stage, and every senator, every noble, every woman or man in his presence was nothing more than an unwilling actor in his twisted play. And the Roman elite, bound by fear, found themselves clapping for horrors they dared not condemn. And as the nights dragged on, Rome whispered in fear. What began as laughter turned into dread. Senators avoided his gaze, nobles prayed for dawn, yet none dared to speak, because in Caligula's Rome, silence was survival. Caligula believed that being emperor made him more than a man. He believed it made him a living god. And if he was a god, then why should he bow to the laws of mortals? Why should he respect traditions or the fragile bonds of family? With this twisted logic, he gave himself permission to indulge in every desire, no matter how shocking. Nobles were summoned to his banquets only to be humiliated in front of their peers, stripped of dignity as laughter echoed through the gilded halls. Promises of loyalty were rewarded not with honor, but with shame. Marriages were torn apart with the wave of his hand, as he took what he wanted, when he wanted it, leaving destruction in his wake. Whispers spread through Rome's streets. The people said the emperor had defiled the sacred sanctity of his own bloodline, turning family into property, and love into possession. The very foundation of Roman virtue seemed to rot under his reign. But in Caligula's mind, none of this was sin. Every act, no matter how grotesque, was cloaked in divine privilege. He told himself, a god cannot be questioned, a god cannot be judged. And yet the most terrifying part was not the whispers of scandal, but the silence of those who witnessed it. Senators bowed lower, soldiers saluted harder, and the Roman people looked away. In that silence, Caligula's madness was not only allowed to live, it was allowed to rule. For Caligula, scandal was never enough. He craved spectacle. Every act, every feast, every moment in his palace was staged like a performance meant to shock, to disturb, and to remind Rome that its emperor bowed to no law but his own. The banquets themselves became infamous. Tables stretched endlessly, covered in gold plates and goblets overflowing with blood-red wine. Exotic dishes from across the empire were piled high, not to feed hunger, but to flaunt power. Lions roasted whole, peacocks dyed in bright colors, and rivers of wine flowed as musicians played in the background. It was less a dinner, and more a theater of madness. But it was not the food or the wealth that silenced the nobility, it was the humiliation. Noble women were paraded before the court as if they were trophies to be displayed, their worth measured not in dignity but in how well they pleased the emperor's whims. The wives of senators, once symbols of status and pride, were summoned and shamed, treated as mere playthings before the eyes of their humiliated husbands. And none dared resist, for resistance meant ruin. Even Rome's sacred temples, places meant for gods alone, were not spared. Priestesses were dragged into Caligula's games, forced to obey commands that desecrated everything Rome held holy. To the emperor, this was not blasphemy, it was proof of his divinity. If he was a god, then even the god's servants existed only to serve him. The city held its breath. Behind closed doors, whispers spread of horror and disbelief, yet outside, the streets remained eerily quiet. Fear had turned Rome into a city of silence. And in that silence, Caligula's spectacles only grew darker, more grotesque, and more untouchable. Fear had become the true currency of Rome, more valuable than gold and more binding than any law. Every street, every whisper, every glance carried the weight of dread. Soldiers patrolled not just to guard the empire, but to guard the emperor's excesses, standing as symbols of loyalty bought with privilege and terror. Their armor gleamed in the sun, but behind the shine was the shadow of cruelty, for they were the hands that enforced Caligula's will. In the Senate, silence reigned. The proud men of Rome, once the voices of law and tradition, now sat powerless, reduced to trembling spectators in a theater of madness. They applauded when commanded, bowed when summoned, and spoke only when it pleased the emperor. Their words, once meant to guide the republic, had become meaningless echoes, swallowed by fear. Among the people, the transformation was just as stark. The same crowds that had once shouted Caligula's name with joy now whispered it in disgust, too afraid to raise their voices higher than a breath. Mothers hushed their children from speaking of him. Merchants closed their stalls when his processions passed, knowing even a wrong glance could invite ruin. And yet, beyond Rome's walls, the empire's shame could not be contained. Foreign visitors carried tales of his cruelty and excess back to their courts. Kings and ambassadors spoke in hushed tones of the Roman emperor who called himself a god, a man who demanded worship not through reverence but through fear. But still, no hand moved against him. For who could challenge one who claimed divinity? Who would dare rise against a man who had convinced Rome that even its gods bowed to him? As the years dragged on, Caligula's behavior only grew more grotesque, more unthinkable. The sanctity of marriage, something sacred to Roman tradition, became little more than a toy in his hands. He dissolved unions at will, forcing apart husbands and wives, not for justice, but for his amusement. What should have been a private bond was mocked, twisted into a spectacle that reminded everyone that nothing, neither family, nor faith, nor love, stood above the emperor's desires. In his palace, boundaries collapsed. The most private of acts, which even the gods themselves were believed to guard, became weapons in his games of domination. Senators feared not only for their power, but for their families, for even the women of Rome's noblest houses could be summoned without warning, paraded like prizes, and discarded once he grew bored. Every scandal was not just a humiliation for Rome, it was a performance. A carefully staged show where Caligula fed his twisted imagination while the empire watched in silence. The city became a theater, and he its cruel playwright. Some historians centuries later tried to soften the stories, dismissing them as exaggeration or rumor. But the whispers echo through too many sources, too consistent, too persistent to ignore. They remind us of one terrifying truth. Under Caligula, Rome was no longer a beacon of power and order, it had become a place where fear, desire, and authority fused into something unspeakable. But absolute power never lasts. The Senate, long silenced by fear, began to plot in whispers. Soldiers, once drunk on his spectacles, grew uneasy. Even those closest to Caligula realized that Rome itself could not survive much longer under his madness. And so, in the year 41 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to shield him with their lives, turned their blades against him. In a dark corridor of his own palace, surrounded by shadows and betrayal, Caligula's reign ended in blood. The empire exhaled, not with celebration, but with relief. Yet the scars he carved into Rome, scars of fear, humiliation, and excess, would remain etched for generations to come. And so Caligula was remembered not for triumphs on the battlefield, nor for wisdom in governance, but for his horrifying excesses. His very name became a symbol, a warning etched into history of how absolute power, when fused with madness, can corrode everything it touches. Roman writers described him as both a god and a beast, a ruler who blurred the line between emperor and executioner. Generations later, his legacy still serves as a reminder that greatness can collapse into ruin, when one man's desires outweigh an empire's stability. But here's the question I leave you with. If Caligula, the so-called mad emperor, could plunge the mightiest empire of its age into such depths, what other secrets might still lie buried, waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of history's rulers?